That's my point. So, I mean, you can only cite somebody more one rules. For the table, I'm sure that right, that's my point. Everybody's so worried about it, which is of course valid. But it's only because it's costing us. Hey, Gary, how was your trip? Jim, we got something with the gym and they didn't screw it up.
Well, of course not. It's a better place for them.
What, thanks. So you had a good time? Oh, you drove? I flew, that would be secret. Oh, wait, you know, I forgot.
Good morning.
We always go to those.
I'm going to Florida. So, how are you?
A hardy perennial you could, but versus digging a bush up. Good morning. Pretty much.
Oh, so what's the story with me?
I don't know. I'm going to stop talking to him and I didn't know. So I'm going to be on everybody. Whether they
So you haven't been able to get the whole thing out. And if you come up our walkway, you'll see the weeds like partially dug out.
I had fruit this morning, water. Oh, and I opened. Listen, I'm as bad as you are because this hand doesn't work all the time. There it is.
Just remember growing up, my father tried so many times to get a thing. That's why I had to go about that.
Nice number right there. I can schedule that.
Okay. She comes in late, but I don't know if it's well. I have this book called Right Plant, Right Place. And it shows which plants are good at which locations. You're just kind of, you're spinning your wheels. Yeah.
Well, Magnolia is fairly rich soil and well drained and good moisture. And I have on 4 magnolias, different flowers on the property, and they do different colors.
And then there's different types of magnolias, the star magnolias.
I do.
Very early.
Yeah, and sometimes they get nipped by frost and they blossom.
One person in
Blooms over.
all with that.
Actually, like, we have 2 of those. One is in the very back of our yard. Those bloom a little later and the blossoms are bigger.
I know.
I don't know what kind I've got in front, but it's working, but I just read it off.
Yeah.
It's good.
And, so
The deer will nibble it years out. Yeah.
Good morning, good morning.
And I never asked, okay? But
I downloaded it, haven't watched yet. The meta of Ariadne,
Oh, okay.
which I'm anxious to see.
Yeah, nice to
Showed up
the hour.
Oh,
I
yeah.
never Well, it's family.
It's a strange piece.
It is a strange piece, isn't it? It's an sort of an uproot and an uproot.
Well, you go, nobody knows who you are, you know.
Well, when you get it downloaded and you have a chance at it.
Well,
there's always
Yeah.
a chance that they
Yeah,
could
Do you-
go to my office and
Do you have
they can my name
Blu-ray?
off the, and I wouldn't have known.
No, how would I
So Jerry,
know?
we're going forward.
I would know if I had it.
Yeah.
Cat overflows, right?
Let's do it again.
Is that a type of technology where you give me something and I have to access it on
Yes and
Blu-ray?
no.
Yeah, do you have a DVD player?
Yes, yes, yes.
Is it recent?
A couple of years.
Probably is.
Oh,
Jordan is one who set me up, so he would know.
Oh, okay.
But, yeah, you know, my view is that's kind of lost. I mean, it's some great things in front of the shop.
You know, I don't know, I don't know any of his later pieces. I don't like electric. I just think it's too high a level
Anxiety,
of emotion, yeah.
that's part of what I love about it, just from beginning to end, he's way up there.
Yeah. And Salome is,
It's a breakthrough opera.
yeah,
Expressionism,
it needs a great Salome.
no question, so does Electra, she's on the stage.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, I've been listening a little bit to his last opera,
Oh, isn't that fantastic?
the last 20 minutes, moving to the end.
I love it.
Yeah, valid here and there, I think. Well, of course, his four last songs.
Yeah. I have a zillion recordings of those piano artists.
Yeah, he returns to the Death and Transfiguration theme.
We should devote an hour instead of Torah. Talking about
Let's do it. Let's do it. I invite Jackie to join us.
oh. Well,
She sat
Maybe.
through 3 ring cycles.
that's too much.
It's not never enough.
Too much for me.
And for most people. Good morning. Shabbat Shalom. Hi, so nice to see everybody.
Rabbi,
Hey, yes.
is this session going to be 4.5 hours?
Is it going to be 4.5 hours? Well, if we start at 6:30, it will be. Bill and I and Tim Tibbetts went to see Don Carlos the other night, Verdi's Don Carlos. There were the 3 of us and one other person in the theater.
Which theater?
Valley View.
Oh, yeah, that was usually
Yeah, now that's a nice theater to watch something like that. You know, it's 4 people, and we got in at 6:30 and got out at 11:30. Yeah, marathon. Totally amazing opera, though, isn't it? I mean, it's just such an achievement. Anyhow, I recommend it. Okay, so welcome to those who are live streaming. Always good to have you as well. And seems that we're growing a little bit here, which is very, very nice. But we love to have live streamers as well. So let's continue with our blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through his commandments and joining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. This is what we're doing. So what I'd like to do is begin a bit of a review of what we've done, a kind of on the way to summary, and just to see what we can make of this hybrid phenomenon of biblical ethics. Hybrid in the sense that the Bible, I've said this over and over again, is not a systematic book. It's not a self-conscious book in the sense of what are we doing, the authors say. They don't say this, I don't think. Even though Deuteronomy, for example, reflects on earlier biblical law and changes a lot of it, even in the guise of being faithful to the original revelation. So Deuteronomy is something of a reflective book. But I think in terms of ethics, in any event, this is about all I can say, and by way of some generalization, is there's a lot of ethics going on and a lot of different categories of ethics which we can try to understand, which I'm going to try to do this morning. But to put it all together in some more systematic or clear way, I think is a challenge beyond me at this point. Maybe somebody has worked it out, but I can't get my head around its organization, so to speak. But maybe that's not necessary to do. William Wordsworth's famous comment that we murder to dissect. To analyze too much is to kill the thing we're analyzing. And maybe we should just leave it alone in terms of what it is and not to make it some other thing, not to turn a profusion of different ethical propositions into something systematic. And maybe that's going to kill the entity, and we certainly don't want to do that. So what I'd like to do is to look again at some general categories. So first of all, let's go back to Genesis chapter 18. We have visited this over and over again over the years, but it's an important passage in so many ways. Genesis 18, starting with verse 16. Genesis 18 has two basic topics. The first half, hospitality, and the announcement to Abraham and Sarah that she, at the age of 90, is going to bear a child. She laughs, but we can't forget that a chapter before, Abraham laughed. So that if the laughter is to be criticized as somehow disbelief, they're both culpable, and not just Sarah. And then beginning with 16, the men who had come to Abraham's tent for hospitality are now on their way to another mission. So that's what I think ties it together. So the men set out from there and looked down towards Sodom, Abraham walking with them to see them off. Now the Lord has said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Since Abraham is to become a great and populous nation, and all the nations of the earth are to bless themselves by him. For I have singled him out that he may instruct his children and his posterity to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is just and right, in order that the Lord may bring about for Abraham what he has promised him." Already that's an interesting comment, though not the main verse that I want to take a look at. But the issue here is natural law. Is there a law embedded in nature or in human nature that yields moral substance? Or is all morality a function of positive law, commandments from God? Does morality find itself in the Bible embedded in revelation? Is it a subcategory of revelation? Or does it exist in the natural world independent of, prior to, revelation? And if that's the case, natural law is available to any human being, and not just to those who are in a community that sees itself as having been commanded by God. Okay? I mean, think of the analogy of our homes, especially as we were growing up. Our parents had house rules, and those rules applied only to that household. That was stipulated law. We might say that there's a common thread that weaves its way through families, ties of emotion among family members that are not the product of stipulation, you shall love your brother, but something that we naturally infer or sense, okay? So that's the difference between natural law that is prior to and independent of revelation and discoverable by all people, and specific law that is given in time to a particular community on whom is who are obligated, only who are obligated to follow those laws. So when God says to Abraham in verse 19 to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is just and right, that is potentially natural law. That Abraham has not been told yet what is just and right. Maybe it is proscriptive, that is, it's going to be elaborated, but there's a presumption here, isn't there, that Abraham already knows what just and right is and can discharge it independently of revelation. I'm not sure if this is the best passage for that claim, but it seems to me embedded in that passage, verse 20. The Lord said, the outrage of Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grave. I'll go down to see whether they've acted altogether according to the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will take notice. The men went on from there to Sodom while Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Abraham came forward and said, and here's what I want to focus on. Will you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? There's a presupposition here that there's something improper, immoral about punishing the innocent for the sake, along with the guilty. How does Abraham know this? What if there should be 50 innocent within the city? Will you wipe out the place and not forgive it for the sake of the innocent who are in it? Notice these are two different claims. One is, let's separate the innocent from the guilty and punish only the guilty. The second claim is, let's have compassion on the whole city if there is some number of innocent people in it. The second part of verse 24, will you then wipe out the place and not forgive it for the sake of the innocent 50 who are in it? The first claim is that the guilty should be punished. The second claim is the guilty should be the recipients of mercy because there is a certain amount of innocent people there. These are two principles of justice and mercy. How does Abraham know this? One could say that Abraham, like all human beings, with a conscience, has the capacity to infer these principles before stipulated law enters the picture. So I think this is a good example of the Bible's acceptance in some way or another of natural law. That is, not all law comes from Sinai and its aftermath, but there is something in the natural world, okay? And somewhere in rabbinic literature, the rabbis say something like, we can learn modesty from the cat, and we can learn different moral attributes from observing how animals, devotion to the beehive. In other words, what does this tell us? That by looking at features of the world, we can infer moral categories, okay? So even though, when you think of the trajectory of the biblical narrative, the high point of the narrative is clearly Sinai, right? The first 11 chapters of the Bible point to the need for law because of the chaos that continues to break out. And then beginning with Abraham, we move through the generations to Joseph, and the people get into Egypt, and they're enslaved, and they're liberated. That already is an idea that those who are vulnerable should be protected. That's an inference we'll see. And then on the way to Sinai. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of bondage, out of the land of Egypt. So it's as if Sinai is the culmination of the story that leads to it. And then, of course, the people are judged after the Sinai legislation, revelation, on the basis of the laws given at Sinai. So if one just looks at the trajectory of the narrative, Sinai would seem to be not only a necessary condition for a just and compassionate society, what is given on Sinai, but a sufficient condition as well. The narrative would seem to suggest that it all now emerges from Sinai, and yet scattered throughout the Bible is another view, that moral principles can be inferred from the workings of nature or human consciousness. No, not consciousness, conscience. Let's look here at the book of Amos, the prophet Amos. And I have a different Bible from most of you, so I'm not going to be able to give you the page. First person that gets the page, shout it out. Amos chapter 1. I'm sorry?
10:15.
10:15. Very good, very good. Amos is one of the so-called minor prophets, not minor in the sense of less important, but in the sense of smaller. The major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, all have 48 chapters or more. Ezekiel has 48 chapters, I think Jeremiah 52, and Isaiah 66. The largest of the so-called minor prophets is Hosea, with 12, or maybe it's 14 chapters. And that's the reason they're called minor. And evidently in the ancient world, all the minor prophets' books, it's 14 chapters in Hosea, were contained on one scroll, the so-called Book of the 12. So I'm looking now at Amos chapter 1. So, the words of Amos, a sheep breeder from Tekoa, see where I am? Who prophesies concerning Israel, that's the northern kingdom, in the reigns of King Uzziah of Judah and Jeroboam the son of Joash of Israel. You can see what's presupposed here is already a divided kingdom. We have Israel and Judah, and we're not given a year here, but time is measured in terms of the reigns of kings. And so King Uzziah of Judah and Jeroboam the son of Joash of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. What's interesting about this as an aside is that scholars seem to have decided the year of the earthquake, which is given in other sources. I mean, I don't know what they are. I haven't looked into it for a long, long time. The earthquake evidently in 751 before the Common Era. So Amos is going to prophesy here in 753. Some scholars think that the book of Amos is a highly edited version of a sermon that Amos gave on Rosh Hashanah morning, 753, before the Common Era. Which is a pretty stunning thing to believe, really, that you can locate when the origin, the substance of this book was delivered. By the way, 753 is only 30 years before the Assyrian invasion of the northern kingdom and the destruction of the northern kingdom and sending the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom into exile. So Amos's, what's interesting about this is not only the proximity temporally between what Amos says and the end of the northern kingdom. But what is the origin of Amos's insight here? And one could say that it's the product of revelation, that God speaks through the prophets. One could also say that Amos is an astute reader of what is going on at the time, that the society has become corrupted through immorality, and that therefore it's more vulnerable to invasion and conquest than it might be were it stronger. Assyria on the rise, the northern kingdom becoming more and more vulnerable through immorality. So is Amos's sermon an ancient New York Times op-ed piece? The product of observation and reflection? Something natural, I might say? Or is it the product of revelation? And of course, we can't decide what it is, but certainly the proximity temporally, only 30 years before the destruction, gives some support to Amos as an astute reader of the currents of the day, which I think is a tantalizing idea. So, verse 2, he proclaimed, the Lord roars from Zion, shouts aloud from Jerusalem, and the pastures of the shepherds shall languish, and the summit of Carmel shall wither. Thus said the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, for 4 I will not revoke it, because they threshed Gilead. So here we have the assault of Damascus on Gilead. The theme I'm going to be picking up here are all of these criticisms of different groups, different nations in Amos's time, all connected to something with Israel, with God's people, we might say. And if the answer is yes, then this might be a reflection of the special relationship between God and Israel. Why is Amos proclaiming against those who assault Israel? Because Amos is trying to suggest that Israel is God's special people, and therefore there's a special concern for what happens to Israel. Okay? Verse 4, I will send down fire upon the palace of Hazael, and it shall devour the fortresses of Ben-Hadad. I will break the gate bars of Damascus and wipe out the inhabitants from the vale of Aven, and the sceptered ruler of Bet-Aen, and the people of Aram shall be exiled to Kir, said the Lord. For thus said the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Gaza. Okay, so Gaza is a Philistine stronghold. For 4 I will not revoke it, because they exiled an entire population which they delivered to Edom. Edom itself is a non-Israelite entity. I will send down fire upon the wall of Gaza, and it shall devour its fortresses. And I will wipe out the inhabitants of Ashdod, another Philistine city, and the sceptered ruler of Ashkelon, another Philistine city. And I will turn my hand against Ekron, and the Philistines shall perish to the last man, said the Lord. Now this is interesting, because this is a description of a conflict between 2 non-Israelite peoples. Unless one infers that non-Israelite peoples are also the recipients of revelation, and they're therefore responsible to reveal law, unless you assume that, and of course, why should we assume it? These are nations outside the purview of Israel and its relationship to God. Unless the Philistines have received this revelation, the inference is that God is punishing them not because they violated revealed law, but because they violated natural law. That these nations are responsible for an innate natural sense of justice, or not dealing outrageously with other nations. They're being punished for what they ought to have understood on their own. Natural law. Let's go to chapter 2. Thus said the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Moab, for 4 I will not revoke it. Now Moab is a non-Israelite nation on the east bank of the Jordan River. Because he burned the bones of the king of Edom, another non-Israelite nation. In other words, this is parallel to what we read in verses 6 and following. And it shall devour the fortresses of Creote. And Moab shall die in tumult amid shouting and the blaze blare of horns. I will wipe out the ruler from within her and slay all her officials along with him, said the Lord. Same idea. That this is the universal God who looks out and makes judgments, for better or for worse, on the activities of human beings, divided into 2 major categories. The Israelites, who are beholden to a certain notion of law and its origin, revelation, and to non-Israelites, not recipients of this law, and therefore culpable only on natural law grounds. Okay? So this is another set of examples of the existence of natural law in a book which the casual observer, of which we are not, would infer that it's all the product of revelation, given the preeminence, the centrality, even the uniqueness of Mount Sinai. And then we go down to verse 4 right after. The Lord said, for 3 transgressions of Judah, for 4 I will not revoke it, because they have spurned the teaching of the Lord, in Hebrew, at Torah Adonai. Here we return to revelation. In other words, the grounds for judging are twofold. One, natural law, just put it that way, and the other, revealed law. Israel is culpable. It's almost as if to say, this is too large an inference, but I'll make it anyway, that since Torah enters verse 4 as the grounds for judgment, by contrast, the first verses, the first episodes, are not Torah grounded and have not observed God's laws. They are beguiled by delusions after which their fathers walked. What do we have here? Something quite interesting aside from what we've just discussed. Over what is God sovereign? We might say, if we looked at the first 20 chapters of Exodus, that God is the God of the Israelites. He takes them out of Egypt. He brings them to Mount Sinai. He gives them tells them to build the Mishkan. What we have in Amos is God is the God of all peoples, and that God can judge non-Israelite nations, and especially when non-Israelite nations have some kind of an activity with other non-Israel. What business is of it of God's, you know? It's like my going to one of the churches here and saying something about I can tell you what my God wants you to do. That's not a very good example, but I thought it was until I started saying it. But now Amos is presupposing something quite fascinating. And that is that God is the God of all peoples and all nations. Whether it has anything to do with God's special people or not. There is a universalism here, isn't there? That I think is quite remarkable. Amos gets to it quite explicitly. Jim?
But in what we just read in Amos, there's no, I don't see any subtle implication that there's any innocent people. But in the Genesis and in God's defense, I think he's saying to Abraham, and of course Abraham wins out according to the story, there are no innocent people here. These people stood by and let it happen.
Okay, so some people that are live streaming have asked me not to forget to repeat the questions. So I'm going to try to do it. So Jim, your point is that there's a difference between the Genesis story and the Amos story. In the Genesis story, the presumption is there are innocent people. Here, there are...
The presumption of Abraham is there's innocent people. The presumption of God is there isn't.
Oh, even in Genesis?
Yeah, because he was willing to wipe everything out.
Although he doesn't.
No.
Well, yes, he does go down and wipe out Sodom and Gomorrah. That's interesting. So that, yeah, he punishes the innocent along with the wicked.
But I think what I get out of it is there are no innocent here. You're not innocent if you stand by and let this happen.
That's true. Are you making that claim about Amos as well?
He's saying it straight out.
Is he? He's just talking about particulars, isn't he?
Yeah, but he's saying, I don't know the exact line, but all the Philistines will be wiped out. There's no exception.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, there are no exceptions within the communities that Amos is addressing, but there might be communities he's not addressing in which there are. Okay. Very, very good. So you're connecting this in a way to the Sodom and Gomorrah thing, where just as God wiped out Sodom and Gomorrah, so too the Philistines or whatever are being wiped out. That's an interesting point. It strikes me, Jim, though, that is an overly large conclusion. I see how you draw it, but you think the Bible, the biblical author, thinks there are no innocent people in these communities?
After reading that passage for
That's your
50
inference.
years,
Yeah.
I would say
Yeah.
he's saying we're all responsible in
Yeah.
some way or another.
Yeah.
And doing nothing isn't an excuse.
Okay. Strikes me as a bit of an large conclusion, but an arresting one. Yeah. Stuart?
It seems to me that Amos is politically savvy enough to see the Assyrians on the march. And he's talking about the Levant, Damascus, Gaza, Tyre, Edom, Ammonites, Moab. He's predicting that the Assyrians are going to conquer all of these countries.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't talk about the Assyrians.
That's an interesting point. And Amos puts it in moral terms, that somehow you've acted badly, so that would be one point of view. The other is power politics.
Yeah.
And what Stuart is suggesting here is, though Amos does seem beholden to something like Sinai, at least for Israel, let me take that back. Some sort of morality,
Yeah.
that nevertheless it can be seen purely in power political terms. I like that. Chaos in the Middle East as a yeah. New. Malcolm?
I feel like we've jumped track. I thought the thesis you were testing a little bit ago was whether all laws came from Sinai.
Right,
or,
right.
Or whether there were natural laws. And then whether in Genesis at Sodom and Gomorrah or in Amos with these non-Israel nations or communities, whence was their basis for having laws and being judged about whether they knew what those laws were or weren't and were acting in accordance with those laws? And so where did those laws come from?
The laws, which laws?
Natural laws.
Natural law?
I thought that's what we're asking, whether there are natural laws separate from laws handed out by God.
Right. And these passages illustrate an affirmative answer to that question. There are laws embedded in the natural world to which people can be held responsible that don't come from Sinai. And that Moab and Edom, that conflict, is not described as part of what those nations are not described as being devoted to or responsible for the laws of Sinai. And therefore, what are they responsible for? The natural laws of how human beings ought to relate to one another. I know that's not a slam dunk, by the way, because they very well may have their own gods and their own laws. But at least Amos seems to be saying, and I find it not conclusive, but suggestive, that as soon as he gets to Israel in verse 4, he brings in Torah. As if to say, nothing like Torah exists before. In a certain way, if one presumes that one of the implications of this is that God is the universal God of all peoples, but doesn't hold non-Israelites responsible for Torah, then there's another origin of their morality that might hold them responsible. That's not Torah. What else could it be? Lots of things. But I'm just making a claim here that one possibility is natural law. That human beings ought to know that they don't engage in beastly activity to one another. In a way, the Geneva Conventions about the morality, the morals of war seem to be part of that too, derived from a sense of some notion of what human beings can be held responsible for inherently. Patty?
Well, God must have thought that there were rules that humans should follow when he wiped out everybody with the flood.
Say that again.
I mean, the flood came early. I double checked, it's on page 11.
Okay.
You know,
The Noah's flood.
Right.
Yeah,
and
good.
Not much time to explain, what the rules even were. He gave a couple hints in the Garden of Eden, then banished everybody. And after that, he determines that there's wickedness, which implies a morality that the humans should have understood.
Yes. So you're presenting this as another example of natural law.
Right.
Yeah. Patty's idea, just to repeat it, that we even find this very early in the Bible, when at the time of Noah, everybody is wiped out, prior to any indication of stipulated law. That's your point. Did you want to draw any other inference from that, or are you just making an example of natural law?
It just seems rather unfair that the expectation seemed to be there early in the Bible, and how are humans supposed to know these things?
Very good. I thought that was what you were driving at. So Patty also feels that even though it may be an expression of natural law and not stipulated law, it seems much too early in the process for all of these people to be held so dramatically accountable for something they haven't had a chance to learn yet. Right, yeah. I mean, right. I guess one could draw two inferences. One, yes, it's natural law, and that clinches this point, or at least it helps to expand it. But two, this application of natural law seems excessive. Why does God hold all these people, everybody in the created world, responsible so early in the process? Yeah. Candy?
I have an answer for that.
Good. By the way, answers are very rare. So,
Anybody who's a teacher knows that in the first week or 2 weeks of school, you make no exceptions, or your classroom will be chaos by the 40th week of school.
so everything is stipulated.
Everything is stipulated.
Right.
And held accountable with practically no exceptions.
That's so interesting.
And you really need to do that for people to learn, for children to learn what's best for them. They need to know it unequivocally in the beginning, and then they begin to understand, and then you can begin to ease up or make exceptions or look at the gray side of things.
I like that. I remember something out of my own education in 11th grade. I and two friends of mine were among 20, 25 people in a history class. And these two friends of mine were among the best students at school. And the first day they were talking to one another, and the teacher just kicked them out of the class. Two of the best students, you would think they would get a little bit of a break, but he made the point very clear at the very beginning. Bennett?
It seems like, to me, that there's a progression. You start with Cain and Abel back in the very beginning, which are individuals. And then you go to the community, which would be the flood, or these other cases, and you come to finally codifying the law at Sinai for the universe, or whatever, for the whole earth.
Look, let me see if I understand what you're saying, that there is a kind of evolution of law,
Right.
that it starts at the very beginning and moves towards Sinai.
Right. And it's kind of taught that way in the Torah.
Yeah, but are you also making the point that part of this process of, let's call it evolution or growth, is a move from natural law to stipulated law?
I don't know. I don't know if it makes any difference.
Yeah. Well, the difference it makes is the necessity of Torah.
Well, whether it's revelation or whether it's natural law.
But if we can infer, if we can
The
create...
Torah assumes that it all comes down from God one way or another.
Does
Unless
it?
He reveal it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Is what you're saying.
okay, all right. So Bill?
I'm amused by the fact that Amos is having God's law, Amos is God, the God of the Jews, law, become universalized in the sense that the transgressions, regardless of how they are related to the laws and the habits of these other people outside of Israel, the Lord shall accept them as transgressions.
Yes.
Of whose law? Obviously, the law of the Lord of Jews. And I think what he is doing here is basically, I don't want to overstate this, is basically saying that there is one God. He is our God. He creates the moral compass of that which is a transgression. And he alone creates the punishment of those transgressions, which leads us right back to the sense that there is only one God, and he is the God of the Jews, and he's the God of all people. And I think it's a bold statement from, what is he? a sheep herder, to make this assumption. So maybe that's why he's a great topic.
So let me see if I understand what you're saying. Essentially that even the laws that the Edomites are bound to observe have their origin in God.
Well, I don't even know if he's concerned with that. I'm basically thinking that regardless of what the Edomites' law is to themselves,
Yes,
or
yes,
their
yes.
customs,
Yes,
there is a greater law, and that is the law of the Jews, and that Lord determines what is a transgression.
yeah.
And that sort of universalizes the whole process of Jewish law
Let's
for
go-
all people.
Let's go back to a simpler example, perhaps, and that is when Cain murders Abel, and God says to him, "Where's Abel?" How do I know? Am I my brother's keeper? So this is a rhetorical question to which the answer is yes. How does Cain know that he's responsible for his brother? The Torah hasn't said word one about Cain's being instructed. So given that, that would seem to suggest that Cain should know this out of his own conscience, that somehow human beings, using reason and perhaps experience, should recognize that yes, we are responsible for, let's just say, one another. If you assume that Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve, are the only individuals on earth at the time, this could be inferred that Cain is responsible for Abel, that human beings are responsible for one another. It's an inference, but we don't need to go there. So, in what sense is this God's law? Torah can absorb that idea that we're responsible for one another, but its origin in the Bible seems to be pre-stipulation. And that am I my brother's keeper? Of course you are. Why would you doubt that? The answer is of course. Isn't that the tenor of that response, or at least Cain's rhetorical question? Of course we are. Anybody knows this. How?
But that's in today's reference to today, not to the reference with there's 2 or 3 people on the entire earth. There's no way that they would have had that kind of insight.
That they would know beyond themselves.
Beyond themselves.
No, good. No, and nothing depends on that.
Right.
Just that relationship, just Cain's rhetorical question. Whose rhetorical question whose answer is this? A rhetorical question begs for an answer. Am I mad? Now, if I ask that, am I mad? And please, if you think yes, give me some evidence. Whereas if I say it, am I mad? What am I saying? No, I'm not mad. A rhetorical question is a disguised declaration. It's not a genuine question. And that's Cain's question. So,
Can I take it one step further?
yeah, do. And then I want to move on.
I mean, I think it goes beyond that, because someplace in here he's saying that he is punishing as a transgression, in effect, incest, of fathers sleeping with their daughters or something like that. I think he's basically saying, even if that is acceptable by those people,
Yes.
God, our God will punish those people,
Yeah.
because that is a transgression of our law.
Of our law.
And he is sort of promulgating it onto other people.
Yeah, but when you say that it is really a violation of our law, you're taking something that's coming much later in the story, as the Bible understands it, and retrojecting it back. As the story is told, it doesn't seem like there's any law at all that God has stipulated or instructed human beings about. the way in which the story is told is that human beings seem responsible for certain actions, that there is right and wrong, before God ever said that there is right and wrong. And that would seem to be a definition of natural law. Let's look at one other example. Job, chapter 31. Job 31, verse 13.
$13.82.
1382. Did I ever brush aside, you see it?
What number?
Chapter 31, verse 13. Did I ever brush aside? See where I am?
Yeah, top of the page.
Did I ever brush aside the case of my servants, man or maid, when they made a complaint against me? What then should I do when God arises, when he calls me to account? What should I answer him? Did not he who made me in my mother's belly make him? Did not one form us both in the womb? Now, I mean, this is metaphorical language for, I think, a fairly straightforward claim that the reason that I have to treat my servants, those who are more vulnerable than I, those who have a lower status. What is the reason? Because he asks a rhetorical question here in verse 13. Did I ever brush aside the case of my servants, man or maid? And the answer is no, I did not. Though I could have. That's the implication, right? Did I ever do what I could do? No. On what grounds did I not brush aside the case of my servant, or man or maid, when they made a complaint against me? Because we are all equal, essentially, from the womb. We are all born the same way. And therefore, societal inequalities mask a fundamental natural equality. This is an appeal to nature, isn't it? That we all come from the same place, and therefore fundamentally we are all equal. And therefore, though I have a societal right to brush aside the case of my servant, I have no natural right to do so. Isn't this another example of natural law? Looking at the way things work and inferring moral principles from it. Okay, so however plausible these examples are, and thank you for other examples earlier in Genesis, it does seem interesting to me in any event, given the centrality of Sinai, and that the prophets, all the prophets, seem to base their judgments on Sinaitic law, that the Torah itself makes room for another origin of our obligations. And therefore, you see, what about the conflict throughout history between reason and revelation? Reason draws conclusions from below, that is, from us out. Revelation comes from above. But it seems the Torah makes room for a kind of harmony, or at least complementarity, between reason and revelation. Reason working with the natural world and not dependent on revelation. Its conclusions seem from this natural law possibility in the Torah to be Jewishly sanctioned. And it strikes me that a person like Maimonides, Let's ask ourselves this question. Couldn't the Bible have started with Abraham? If it's really the story of the people, it could have started with even Exodus, the adventures of the people. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the house of bondage, and so on. That would seem to give a particularistic view of the history of the Jewish people. But the Torah starts with creation. And creation is a universal category. Revelation is a particular category. So another way of putting this, that the Torah allows a complementarity between reason and revelation. Reason, what we utilize to manage our lives from the ground up, seems not to be an opponent of revelation or irrelevant, but sanctioned by this whole creation-oriented, natural law orientation that is a significant part of the Bible. I think a large conclusion can be drawn from this. Not that reason is an opponent of revelation, but its complement. Okay, Gary?
A couple of points. Isn't it true that God shopped around the Torah to many, many, many different peoples, and all declined it, except the Jewish people?
Yes.
So could it possibly be that God's anger and his willingness to eliminate peoples has to do with the fact that they, at some point or another, did not accept the Torah, a written form of laws?
So Gary is raising the question of God's
revenge?
God's starting by considering all peoples as, I'm expanding your point, as possible recipients of the Torah. And people ask, what's in it? Thou shalt not murder. Well, my gosh, you can't hold me responsible for that. No. Don't take God's name in vain. That's too much for me, said the Moabites. No, I'm not taking it. Finally, he went to the Israelites and they said, how many are there? God said 10, but men 613. And the Israelites said yes. On the basis of which, God is now angry at those who have rejected the Torah. And this accounts for his anger toward the others. That's your idea. And by the way, that story is not biblical. It's rabbinic, trying to account for, in a way, the burdens of Torah. Yeah, they're burdensome, and a lot of people said no because it's too much. But the Jews said yes, even though we find it hard to follow them. Yeah. Okay, I don't want to go on too much longer with this. I want to move on to something else. Malcolm.
I suggest that natural laws are God-given laws.
You could say that.
Genesis, and you asked about where the Torah should begin. It began at creation, and God created the universe.
Yes.
And the natural laws are the laws of the universe.
Right. But to whom are they accessible? And for whom are they accountable?
To all living things.
Everybody. Everybody. So in a sense, those laws are universal. And were they adequate, we could say that we don't need Sinai. We need Sinai because they're not adequate. But to the degree that they exist, to that degree, everybody, this is the question. Look, one could say that God implanted, and maybe that's an inference from the Torah, that whatever exists in the natural world comes from God. Yeah. And the Torah spins it out in the 7 days of creation. It encompasses the whole. The heavens above, the earth below, the seas below the earth. What else is there, right? But it seems to me the question is not so much its ultimate origin is the ways of accessing it. the ways to access the food laws in Leviticus are not by looking at the natural world. These are stipulated contingent laws, contingent upon the laws themselves and not inferable from the natural world. So that stipulated law is relevant only for those to whom it is stipulated, whereas natural law, whatever the origin, is incumbent upon everybody.
Natural laws are necessary but not sufficient for this species.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. Another way of saying it is that reason is necessary but not sufficient. And I don't know that scientists would accept that. Scientists wouldn't accept it. That science is the product of method and mind. And if a scientist introduced in his explanation or her explanation of the results of an experiment, I used my reason and I made inferences, but also God came in and filled in the gaps. That scientist would be read out of the profession, right? Because reason is sufficient for scientific discovery. Am I wrong about this? Maybe it's not sufficient for the lived life of any scientist, that we might say that we need poetry, that we need the arts, and that, that we need stipulated law. But one of the assumptions of modern science is that the universe is a closed system, and that it is in principle coherent, and its laws discoverable, and we don't need anything outside the created world in order to inform our inferences. You know what I'm inclined to do here? To put my head down and to move on. Anybody have something that must be said at this point?
You started this.
I'm sorry? I started it. By the way, let me take this whole 45 minutes and it's not important. Okay, what I want to do now is I want to look at the Ten Commandments again as an example or an illustration of different ways of positing law. Okay? So, Exodus chapter 20. So, the first category is divine command, that these laws come from God and that they are universal and non-hypothetical. Okay? So I think all of the Ten Commandments are universal and non-hypothetical. Non-hypothetical means not dependent upon the circumstances in which they are understood. So for example, as a contrast, just look at chapter 21, verse 2. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, I don't want to get into the slave business here, but only that, starting with chapter 21, we're also dealing with hypothetical law. If certain things obtain in certain conditions, you're to act in a certain way. If then, when then, hypothetical. If you eliminate the first part of when, the when, and just start with then, thus, this is stipulation. That is non-hypothetical. So, chapter 20. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. Now, our tradition, the Jewish tradition, at least in its Palestinian formulation, not in its Alexandrian or Greek, are two commandments. The first verse is, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, is a commandment. You are to worship me. I am God alone. And the second, you shall have no other gods before me. Notice this is not hypothetical. It doesn't say, under certain circumstances you shall not worship other gods. It's purely categorical, you shall have no other gods. Look at verse 5. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. Verse 7, verse 5, let's go on. So this categorical stipulation now has either motive clauses attached or consequences attached. In other words, a pure stipulated law, have no other gods before me, doesn't say on the basis of the following motive, or there will be these consequences. Irrespective of motive and consequences, have no other God before me. Okay? So this is a sort of a categorical imperative. Now if we look at verse 5, you shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am an impassioned God. This is a motive clause. What's the reason for not bowing down to them? Which is categorical, but I'm trying to get you to have a motive for it. Namely, God has potentially anger toward those who don't follow this law. And not only is God an impassioned or jealous God, but God visits the guilt of the parents upon the children, upon the third and the fourth generations of those who reject me. I must do it irrespective of circumstance, but if I need motivation to do it, here are two motivations. God will get angry for noncompliance, and what you do will have consequences for subsequent generations. You shall not, verse 5 again, bow down to them or serve them. I should not make anything but God my ultimate concern. Now let me think about that for a minute. I don't know. Why shouldn't I have passions for certain things and make them ultimate for me? Learning, prestige, things that we might decry as our ultimate concern. But why should I have as my ultimate concern believing in one and only one God? I'm having some problems motivating myself. But notice the Torah, and the Torah, I think, recognizes implicitly that this may be hard to do, even though I must do it in all circumstances at all times. God is an angry God. And if you don't do it, you may be the victim of God's anger, just as Gary said, was it Gary or Jim, that this is why God is feeling a certain vengeance toward other peoples. And also, what I do is going to have consequences for subsequent generations. Well, I don't buy the imperative fully, but I don't want those consequences. And therefore, as motives for doing what I may not be inclined to do, the Torah offers blandishments. It offers reasons for doing it, even though they're non-hypothetical. Jim?
Isn't that the horrendous situation of the binding of Isaac?
Namely?
Namely, he's commanded to do something that goes against just about everything anybody would do.
Right.
So, and it's paradoxical because subsequent generations will suffer, but the action will cut off the future generations.
But it's imperative anyway.
But it's imperative anyway.
Right,
which
right.
makes the story horrendous from every angle.
No question about it. I mean, this is really a story about testing whether or not faith is so strong that even in impossible circumstances we're going to believe in God, right? It's a test of Abraham. It's a test of the limits of faith. I think that's a good point. Let's look at verse 11. Well, let's start with 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Once again, an absolute imperative. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. Don't do any work, you, your son, your daughter, your slave, your cattle, your stranger, in your settlements. In other words, verse 6 gives the imperative. Verses 9 and 10 elaborate on it. This is what we mean, right? 6 days do all your work, but the seventh day, and so on, okay? Now look at verse 11. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the Sabbath day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Okay? So, what's the reason for it? I might ask, why should I keep the seventh day? There's an implied justification, and that's based on imitation of God. This is how God did it. God rested on the seventh day. We therefore have an obligation, because of God, the foundation laid down by God, to do it. Okay? So it's a motive clause. And I'm suggesting to you that motive clauses presuppose some problem, psychological problem I might say, for doing it at all. Why should I do what I must do? Because God set the precedent, and therefore we must imitate God. That, I think, is the suppressed premise, unexpressed premise. Okay, let's look at verse 13. Here we have a very different kind of law. It's again stipulated, it's absolute. That's one of the characteristics of the Ten Commandments. But here, no motive clause and no set of consequences is conjoined with the law itself. You shall not murder. And it doesn't say why I shouldn't do it, the way some of the earlier Ten Commandments do. You shall not commit adultery. It's not that these laws are crystal clear, because murder is wrongful killing. And what counts as wrongful killing requires a discussion. It's not obvious what's wrongful killing. I think Gandhi or Martin Luther King would think that certain acts are wrong, even if the bulk of society might think they're right. Fighting back. This whole notion of nonviolence, which served Martin Luther King so very powerfully. I think most of us would say, look, I can fight back. I can defend myself. Whereas Gandhi and Martin Luther King, I'd said. So there's a difference here between groups as to what counts as murder. Commit adultery. What's the definition of adultery, and so on. You shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, and so on. So what's interesting about the Ten Commandments is we have different kinds of imperatives, some of them straightforward, some of them requiring some explanation, all of them categorical. There's no hypothetical quality, and I think that may be what gives the Ten Commandments a certain singularity. That these are the things incumbent upon all of us at all times, irrespective of situations. Let's move to Leviticus chapter 19. Notice on the kind of meta question of how are we to understand the whole understanding of ethics and law in the Bible. Not how are we to understand specific laws, but how are we to understand the whole enterprise of making of law and imperatives. To answer that question, we would have to focus on at least Exodus 20, the Ten Commandments, and Leviticus 19. These are fundamental chapters which tell us something about biblical law and biblical ethics. So let's just look at verses 11 and then to 13. These are laws for the community. What lays the foundations for community harmony and coherence? You shall not steal. You shall not deal deceitfully or falsely with one another. You shall not swear falsely by my name, profaning the name of the Lord your God. You shall not defraud your fellow. You shall not commit robbery. The wages of a laborer shall not remain with you until morning. Notice there's some overlap here with the Ten Commandments. Some of the Ten Commandments also reappear in chapter 19. You shall not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God, I am the Lord. You shall not render an unfair decision. Do not favor the poor or show deference to the rich. Judge your kinsmen fairly. Do not deal basely with your countrymen, or do not go up and down tale-bearing. Don't profit or don't stand by the blood of your neighbor. Now, these are all social commandments. What gives society its coherence? Although it's in a theological context, isn't it? That these are stipulated laws, I am the Lord, and so on. And then a series of verses that we have dealt with at some length, verses 17 to 19. Don't hate your kinsfolk in your heart, leading to, at the end of 18, love your neighbor as yourself. And we looked at that as a kind of mini narrative. Notice that this chapter also deals with family law in a very rudimentary way. Verse 3, you shall each revere his mother and his father and keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Okay? So the centrality of family and reverence. In the Ten Commandments, it's not revere, it's honor. So we have to deal, if we want to do this in a more complete way, look at the verbs honor and revere. Maimonides thinks of them as honor as moving toward our parents, and revere recognizing the difference, the gap between our parents and ourselves. Parents are not required to honor their children. What parents are required to do is to teach their children. And the rabbis give other examples of that, to circumcise their sons and to teach them how to swim and to teach them how to make a living. These are the Talmud goes on. Teach them how to swim is to teach them survival skills, how to make it through a complex world. Notice, by the way, and we talked about this several weeks ago, you shall each revere his mother and his father and keep my Sabbaths. You remember what Rashi draws from this? That this tells us what the parent's mandate is. Because what Rashi says is, and keep my Sabbath suggests that both you and your parents are obligated to keep God's laws, and therefore, if the parent asks the child to violate a law, the child has the right to disobey that because both parents and children are obligated to Torah and to God. And this suggests what the role of parents is, not to be sources of absolute power in the family, I am the boss, but to be teachers and to raise the children in order to become self-sufficient and parents of their own. So the parents have a role here, not to be a self-enclosed unit where the parent is the sole power, but to be sure that the family serves the needs of continuity, which are dependent upon each generation being able to take charge on its own. So there's power as Rashi draws it out. By the way, those of you who were here last night and heard Rabbi Dadun give her Devar Torah, And she made a distinction between exegesis and isogesis, between reading from the text and reading into the text. And the eisegesis idea she redefined as subjectivity. I put my own ideas and values into my reading of the text and therefore draw from my reading what I have put into it. And one of the questions about exegesis and eisegesis is, in interpreting a text, is there any possibility of drawing something from the text which I did not put into it? How can I know that my subjective preference isn't the sole sufficient source of my interpretation? And that depends upon being able to make a distinction between what I've put in and what I've taken out. So let me ask you this question about verse 3. Rashi's inference that this is about hierarchy. There are children, there are parents, and as a child I should honor, I should revere my parents, but that above both of us is God, to whom both parents and child are beholden. So over and against God, the hierarchy between parents and children disappears. Within the family, it works, but the parent must recognize that above both of them is God and God's commands. So let me ask you this question. Is Rashi here doing exegesis or eisegesis? What do you think? What do you think? You say exegesis.
No, iso.
You say eisegesis. Rashi is reading his understanding of the relationship between parents and children, and between parents and children and God. This is Rashi's idea. This is not derivable from the Torah itself. Would you say 100% eisegesis? 98.
Mostly.
Mostly. Okay. Other thoughts about it? This is an interesting question, I think. Vivian, do you have a thought?
Well, let me just, we're extracting that relationship, so that's exegesis.
Exegesis. What do you mean we're extracting?
Well, when you say the hierarchy, we're reading it as a hierarchy, meaning that it's all related.
Okay.
So it's in and out, is it not?
So Vivian is thinking of it in this way. There are three entities in this. There's children, there are parents, there's God. One could read this as A and B and C, non-hierarchical. Or one could read it, since the sequence is A, B, C, let's read this as an ascending order and not merely a parallel order. We got children, we've got parents, we have God. That's Gary's reading. And if you want to make a hierarchy out of it, you're putting that into your reading. Vivian is saying the hierarchy is there. You have a rationale for that?
Well, it's continuity. I mean, it speaks to generations, so it's modeling for generations to come, based.
Where do you get? It's quite clear that there is a hierarchical relationship in this verse between parents and children, because it's asymmetric, isn't it? It's not children should revere their parents and parents should revere their children. Then it would be symmetrical. It's one way, it's asymmetrical. Children have an obligation to their parents that parents don't have to their children, and therefore, in that sense, the parents are a level above the children. There is an obligation incumbent on the children, not incumbent upon the parents. But is there an asymmetrical relationship between the unit, parents and children, and God? One could say no. It's just this and this and this. Now, one could say that since my Sabbaths is God, and that comes last, and therefore includes all that precedes it. So rather than A and B and C, it's A and B, parentheses, A and B, and C, which then might imply that C is on a higher level than A and B.
And bringing in the Sabbath, to me, suggests a continuity and time, because Sabbath is every week, and that becomes a habitual and generational construct.
So the burden on the exegete here, the one who wants to do exegesis, is to try to show some sort of hierarchy, some sort of ascent at each level. You've done it in terms of time. I've suggested it in terms of God. So you have children below parents, but it's quite obvious that when you bring God into the picture, God is above both, and therefore hierarchy. Whether you could make that claim, I mean, my goal here is not to settle the issue, but to use it as a good example of how we know that an interpretation is hooking on to something in the text and not merely imposing on the text. I once did a series on, maybe some of you were there many, many years ago, on a comparison between Beethoven's Diavelli Variations and Midrash. Theme and Variations is parallel to Torah and interpretation. Variations are interpretations of some fundamental unit. So the analogy is Beethoven's basic theme to its variations as Judaism's fundamental book, Bible, and its interpretations. And I tried to make a distinction between two types of variation, imitative and transformational. The imitative variation is discernibly drawn from the, if a composer has a theme, and then variation one, he puts some trills to the various notes, it's quite obvious that there's a close connection between theme and its variation. So there are variations that are clearly drawn from the theme. Let's call it exegesis. Nobody would say about the first 5 or 6 variations that they're not the product of exegesis, reading from the theme. But when you get to the later variations, the connection is extremely tenuous. And the one committed to exegesis, namely that these really are variations, has to look very hard at what the connection is, which is not at all obvious. But I tried to make the case that even these variations that are far afield are nevertheless exegetical, that they have a root in the text, however tenuous. Let's think of the binding of Isaac's story. Who is the most culpable in that story, or the most subject to culpability? Abraham. But a modern interpretation wants to claim it's God. That God does something very problematic as putting Abraham to that excruciating text. Well, that's a post-Holocaust interpretation, isn't it? Where we question where was God in the Holocaust. So the question for that interpretation is, what is the evidence that God is culpable in the text? And I don't think there is any in that chapter. because God says, finally, I see that you're a person of great faith, and therefore I don't exact this particular action on your part. Now, the author of that midrash claims that the evidence is Abraham never speaks to God again. It's as if Abraham recognizes that he is now on his own, and he can act according to God's dictates, the promises of progeny and land. Abraham gets on his own in subsequent chapters. As if Abraham is now following the commands of God while recognizing that the relationship to God is very problematic. Any God who would ask this of Abraham has got to be a problematic God. And the evidence in the text is no conversation ever again. So one could say, I wonder if you agree with this, that one can save this interpretation from the charge of eisegesis. You're just reading the Holocaust into this text. I see what you're doing. You're just trying to make this a Holocaust text. Whereas one could claim that evidence for it, lo and behold, is in the text itself. That the relationship is over, but Abraham is still faithful. Vivian?
The relationship is over, Abraham is on his way, but what if it's God who never speaks to Abraham again? And Abraham takes that as his going forward.
Yeah. No, I think that is plausible. One of the reasons for the other interpretation to be plausible is that Abraham begins the fulfillment of the two major promises on his own. It's as if I accept God's mandate without accepting God.
And he accepts his invisibility moving forward.
He's what now?
He accepts his invisibility, his infinity, his beyond reach.
So he's not
yet
abandoned.
he still can act as God would have him act.
Isn't that interpretation? You're saying that it might be that God abandoned Abraham.
Well, abandon is a strong word, but they're not intimates any longer.
Good. No, I think that's a good counter to this idea. Anyhow, we have to stop so that next week we'll continue along this line. I'm hoping that we'll bring ethics to a close here before too long and move on to our next topic. Okay, Shabbat Shalom.
Who was it to say
But anyways, this last conversation we had,
you're prepared for going to the office? Cleaning up.
And so is it that we believe that God is the one who was wrong? Well, Abraham withdrew from God, but he withdrew off from God, and God was wrong.
Well, that's that interpretation that Abraham is now recognized as on his own because God and Abraham never talked again. Vivian's raising the question, who's not talking to whom? This interpretation is that Abraham is not talking to God because he recognizes a charge by Abraham. And that is because the text itself doesn't have Abraham talking to God after.
I believe that Abraham wasn't going to talk to God because Abraham decided, but the question is, when this was the task that Abraham to do, the initial question was, who was at fault? Abraham was listening to God, or God? Who was the culprit? So that was the first
The answer to that, I think, is the story as it comes is a test of Abraham. That Abraham was challenged about what is the extent of the peace is about. So it's a
Did she say something?
honor my commandment more than love your son. I mean, give up your son.
And he
If I
was.
ask you to do it. And he was. And so Abraham is faithful, but the test is Abraham. Abraham is being tested. This modern interpretation is really it's God who is being tested here. As a God.
Wait a minute, the blame for this even taking place. That we even have the story to talk about. Who's to blame for starting it, you know? And that's where I thought.
That is really the question. Is Abraham culpable for either not obeying God or obeying God? One can do it. But God is also potentially culpable in asking something so extreme. And so one could say that both of them
I'm gonna listen to your questions.
Looking at it can be both ways.
definitely. But innovation is to think that it's God who is
Is it every,
So how will
every
everything
night?
gives rise to that project at all of what how can we trust God? But the outcome is that the answer is in some sense no. That what this episode reveals is we can't really put our hands, throw our weight with God. Look at what happens after this.
I can't.
And the claim I was making was that this interpreter is really being exegetical because he has found a hook in the text itself. And that's the criterion. Is this just
Variation
fanciful?
in the music, you find the connection.
Even the most far-flung variation can be, through scrutiny, shown to be there.
That was a very good analogy, using music with a variation. Not that I am classical music like you are, but it made sense what you were saying. Thank you.
You're
That was
welcome.
good week. Enjoyed the Shabbat service too, it was nice.
Good.
It's Mal's question, I'm just gonna listen.
Let's move away from that.
Question of, what's the source of a couple during the mid-season when they were taking them out, I don't know, a couple of them sitting all the way through.
What do you think you're doing? I'm glad you woke up too. I miss you. You can't party all night.
It has to catch up with me sometime. Five and six. Oh, no, they're all
It's not done yet.
Oh.
He's gonna have a bar mitzvah.
So the act of creation
What's this
State
one?
Farm is this matter. For the body.
forming a pre-existing pattern.
Which is
And I didn't do it. And so I was filling out forms.
I've never made it.
Half an hour to fill out these forms.
Probably every.
my
So
brother,
that's so.
no kidding, my brother came over 2 weeks ago because, short and sweet, his car lease is up. They don't have any cars to give him, so what's the buy it? So they sent a letter.
Fortunately, my
If you
mind
wanna buy
says
it,
we can't prove it.
respond to this.
Because that's Aristotle's view.
Or go.
The universe is eternal.
They're all dead.
So my mind saves the
So
Torah.
I called, I said, okay, what's the zip form? other week at night. Yesterday, she comes over, gets on the phone, just fill out the following, send us a check for the balance. Here's the balance. Okay. I said, well, that can't be right. But then it was right, because I included sales tax. They don't. Because when you go to re-register the car, you gotta pay the sales tax. So anyway.
All right. An important thing, because the sales tax is hundreds of dollars. Right.
So, anyway, we're trying to figure this out, we fill the forms out, and I said, you better wait a day or two to see if they call you back before you make it. I said, send it registered, and run it by the 11th, by Tuesday. And instead of going through all this crap, because they had no, I wanted to lease another car, they don't have it.
Our grandchildren.
Which we've been through way more than we need.
I realize that, that's good. I just
Well, fortunately,
I'm gonna sell it.
wait till it's
Just not
all
like-
settled before you and before you switch insurance.
I am.
In fact, you better wait at least 6 months before you switch, because the other companies,
Oh, I just renewed, March 27th.
for 6
Renewed
months or a year.
for 6 months. I pay everything.
Because the other
But
companies,
you can cancel anytime.
yeah, I know, but you don't want to, because the other companies are looking to why you switch.
What Nancy got.
So give it
So
6
just
months.
stay with them?
No, check rates.
They're so horrible.
Check rates.
I'll check it.
Yes.
Yeah, and if you want, I'll give you a broker I use, because they're just a rep from all of them. They compare them for it.
Yeah.
When God began to create,
And it's,
I was gonna ask. It's done.
okay.
But it doesn't,
You
you
cannot be
just
able
told me to wait 6 months.
I would.
Yes, I know, it's the right thing to do, although I mean, this is going to be here yet.
Well,